The phone is face down, but your body is not convinced. It keeps listening. Every few minutes, some small part of you still reaches for the sound that never comes, the vibration that never happens, the message that never appears. And what makes it harder is that you are not even waiting in the obvious way anymore. You are not sitting there pretending to be calm. You are not refreshing the screen every 10 seconds. You are not telling your friends, not this time, not again. But inside, something is still standing at the door. Not because you are weak, not because you do not know better, but because for a long time, you have been protecting his image more carefully than your own truth. You have been editing the story in your head so he can remain understandable, decent, complicated, wounded, busy, overwhelmed, not ready, misunderstood, not that bad, maybe tired, maybe afraid, maybe going through something, maybe just needing space. You keep polishing the version of him that hurts you less, and the cost of that is quiet, but heavy. Because every time you soften the truth about him, you harden the truth about yourself. Every time you explain away what happened, you step 1 inch farther from your own clarity. Every time you say, he didn't mean it like that, or he has a good heart, or he just doesn't know how to show it, you are not only protecting him, you are abandoning your own perception. That is the part nobody warns you about. The body knows when the mind is lying to keep the peace. It knows when you smile too quickly after being disappointed. It knows when you say, it's fine, and your chest tightens. It knows when you keep giving someone the benefit of the doubt long after they have stopped giving you basic emotional honesty. And if you listen closely, the exhaustion is not coming from love. It is coming from the effort of maintaining a false version of reality. This is where Carl Jung becomes important, because Jung understood something that modern love advice often misses. The psyche does not suffer only from what happens to us. It also suffers from what we refuse to see. The unconscious keeps score. It remembers the moments when you saw the truth and then immediately covered it over with a story that felt more bearable. That story becomes a kind of mask. Not his mask first, yours. You start wearing the persona of the understanding woman, the patient woman, the woman who is above drama, above need, above accusation, above disappointment. And at first, that persona feels noble. It feels mature. It feels like love. But over time, it becomes a cage with a beautiful name. You become the keeper of his innocence in your own mind. You become the translator of his silence, the defender of his inconsistency, the emergency shelter for his mixed signals. And somewhere in all of that, you stop asking the only question that actually matters. What is true? Not what is possible, not what is hidden, not what might be underneath if you dig hard enough and make excuses for long enough. What is true? Did he show up? Did he speak clearly? Did his actions match the tenderness you were trying to believe in? Did you feel safe, or did you feel managed by hope? Those questions are uncomfortable because they do not feed fantasy. They feed self-respect. And self-respect is often the first thing to disappear when you are trying to preserve someone else's image. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing you have been loyal to a version of a person that exists mostly in your imagination. Not because you invented everything. Often, the beginning was real enough. A look, a conversation, a feeling of being seen, a moment that opened something in you. That part was real, but what you built after that may have been less about him and more about the hunger he awakened. That is one of the deepest Jungian traps, projection. Projection is not just seeing what you want to see. It is the psyche placing an inner image onto another person, and then responding to them as if they carry the key to something buried inside you. You may call it chemistry. You may call it fate. You may call it a strong connection. Sometimes it is all of those things. But projection is dangerous when it begins to protect the image more than the truth. Because then you are not only loving a person, you are also loving the possibility that they complete a story in you. You are loving the relief you think they might bring. You are loving the version of yourself that feels chosen, special, finally seen, finally safe. And when the real person does not match the inner image, the psyche often does something strange. It does not immediately let go. It doubles down. It starts explaining. It starts negotiating. It starts protecting the dream from the facts. You tell yourself that maybe he is afraid of intimacy. Maybe he is emotionally unavailable because something happened in his past. Maybe he is guarded. Maybe he is not used to being loved well. Maybe your presence unsettles him. Maybe he cares more than he can admit. Some of that may even be true. But truth is not the same as permission. A wounded person can still wound you. A confused person can still confuse you. A man can be emotionally limited and still be responsible for the impact of his choices. Understanding someone is not the same as excusing the pattern that keeps hurting you. This is where many women lose themselves. They become so skilled at empathizing with the wound that they stop respecting the effect. And the effect is what your body has been trying to tell you all along. The stomach that drops when you see his name. The strange alertness in your shoulders when you think about replying. The way your mood rises and falls based on whether he has been warm, distant, inconsistent, present, absent. The way your nervous system starts to organize itself around his timing. The way your day becomes a weather report based on one person's emotional temperature. That is not love at its healthiest. That is a psyche caught in a loop. Jung would call this the work of a complex. A complex is not just a bad feeling. It is an emotionally charged pattern that gets activated and starts thinking through you. It pulls old pain into the present. It makes current events feel bigger than they are because they are touching something older, deeper, and unfinished. Maybe his silence is not only about him. Maybe it is touching every earlier moment when you felt you had to earn attention. Maybe his distance is hitting the part of you that learned to wait, to hope, to soften yourself, to become easier to love. Maybe the fear is not just, what if he leaves? Maybe the deeper fear is, what if I stop protecting his image and discover I was not as valued as I needed to believe? That is the wound under the wound. Because once you tell yourself the truth, you can no longer hide inside the story that kept you hoping. And hope, when it is attached to self-abandonment, can become a very elegant form of suffering. You keep saying, I just need clarity. But sometimes clarity is already here. It is simply not flattering. It says he has shown you enough. It says the pattern is consistent. It says the silence is information. It says the inconsistency is information. It says the emotional distance is not an accident. It says your nervous system is reacting for a reason. And this is where the real turning point begins. Not when he suddenly explains himself. Not when he finally sends the perfect message. Not when the whole story resolves in a way that makes your pain feel justified. The turning point begins when you stop asking your fear to write the script for his character. You stop saying, he must have meant well, as if meaning well is enough to protect your heart. You stop treating confusion like depth. You stop mistaking your own longing for evidence, and you begin to notice something very important. The more you protect his image, the less room there is for your own reality. That is a brutal exchange, because your reality has been trying to speak through tiny signs for a long time. The way you feel drained after certain conversations, the way you rehearse messages before sending them, the way you feel yourself shrinking when you need to ask for something simple, the way you start performing calm while your insides are in knots. That performance is the persona. The persona is the face we present to the world to keep belonging, to keep love, to keep control, to keep from being seen as too much. There is nothing wrong with having a persona. We all need one. But when the persona becomes more important than the truth, it separates us from the self. And the self, in Jungian language, is not just your ego's preferred version of you. It is the deeper center of your being, the part that knows what is real before you can explain it. The self does not need a perfect story. It needs honesty. That is why the body often knows first. Before the mind admits it, the body has already registered the imbalance. Before you can name the pattern, you feel the fatigue. Before you can justify the distance, you feel the ache. Before you can admit the truth about him, you feel the cost of protecting him. You may even notice that you are more upset by your own denial than by his behavior. Because once you see how much energy it takes to keep someone innocent in your mind, you realize that the exhaustion is not just heartbreak, it is inner conflict. One part of you knows, another part refuses to know, and those two parts are pulling against each other every day. That tension is painful, but it is also sacred in a strange way. Because tension can become awakening when you stop trying to end it too quickly. The mind wants relief. The psyche wants truth. And truth often arrives in a quiet, humiliating sentence. Maybe he is not confused in the way I wanted to believe. Maybe he knows enough. Maybe I have been doing the emotional labor for both of us. Maybe I have been translating absence into love because I was afraid of what the absence actually meant. That is the moment the spell begins to break. Not because you become cold, not because you become cynical. not because you decide no one is trustworthy, but because you stop confusing compassion with distortion. You can still have compassion for his limitations and still tell yourself the truth about what those limitations cost you. You can still wish him well and still refuse to live inside the fog. You can still understand his wounds and still stop making them your home. This is not cruelty, this is differentiation. And differentiation is one of the most mature acts of the psyche. It means you can hold two truths at once. He may be wounded, and he may be unable to meet you. He may care, and he may still not be capable of the consistency you need. The connection may have meant something, and it may still not be safe to keep feeding it. That is a hard sentence to live with, because it removes the fantasy of clean endings. But clean endings are not always how life works. Sometimes the ending is a slow inner correction. A woman sitting alone with her phone and realizing she does not want to keep defending a story that keeps hurting her. A woman standing in front of the mirror and hearing the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. A woman reading an old message thread and finally feeling not longing, but clarity. The thread is still there. The messages are still there. The past is still there. But the spell is weaker now, because you have started to see that protecting his image often meant protecting your hope from collapse. And hope, when it is built on denial, asks for a sacrifice every day. It asks for your intuition. It asks for your peace. It asks for your standards. It asks for your ability to say, "This is not enough for me," without immediately apologizing for having needs. That is the deeper truth most people avoid. They think the pain comes from losing the person. Often, the pain comes from losing the illusion that kept the person emotionally available in your mind. And yes, that loss hurts. It can feel like grief. It can feel like betrayal. It can feel like waking up in a room you thought was yours and realizing you have been living in borrowed furniture. But grief is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes, grief is the psyche's way of clearing out a false attachment so reality can enter. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. I am done protecting what keeps me from the truth. You do not need to post it. You do not need to announce it. You only need to let your nervous system hear it. Because the body changes when the truth is finally spoken. Your breathing changes. Your shoulders drop a little. The constant internal rehearsing begins to slow. You stop building court cases in your head for why he might still be good for you. You stop treating every ambiguous gesture like evidence. You stop making your tenderness do the work of proof. And then something surprising happens. The silence that once felt like a message begins to feel like what it was. Silence. Not prophecy, not destiny, not a secret code. Just silence. That may sound small, but it is huge. Because silence is where projection thrives. Silence is where the mind writes stories without interruption. Silence is where the fantasy can look noble because it is never tested. Silence can feel sacred when you are starved for certainty. But silence is not a substitute for substance. And when you finally stop protecting his image, you start hearing what the silence has been saying all along. That your imagination has been carrying too much of the relationship. This is where many women fear they are becoming hard. They are not. They are becoming less available to self-deception. There is a difference. Hardness is a wall built from pain that refuses to feel. Truth is a boundary built from pain that finally understood its own value. Hardness says, no one gets in. Truth says, not like that. Hardness punishes. Truth protects. You are not being asked to punish him in your mind. You are being asked to stop sentencing yourself to a story that keeps you emotionally on trial. Because when you protect his image, you often become the defendant in your own inner courtroom. You ask yourself if you were too much, too sensitive, too needy, too impatient, too intense, too quick to hope, too slow to let go. You put yourself under cross-examination while his inconsistency sits there unchallenged. That is where the shadow enters. The shadow is not only the dark part of a person, it is also what we refuse to admit about our own role in a pattern. Not blame. Role. The shadow can hold our denial, our hunger, our fear of being ordinary, our fear of being rejected, our fear of having chosen wrong. It can hold the part of us that would rather be disappointed by another person than face our own need to be chosen. That is why truth feels so sharp. It touches the shadow. And yet, the shadow is not your enemy. It is a place where your power has been hidden. The moment you admit, "I have been protecting his image because I was afraid of what his real behavior would mean about me," you begin to reclaim your energy from the fantasy. You stop outsourcing your worth to a person who has not been holding it carefully. You stop asking him to validate what you already know in your bones. This is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about becoming loyal to your own perception. That is a form of maturity that changes everything. Because once you trust what you see, you no longer need to turn every red flag into a rose. You no longer need to turn every absence into a test of your patience. You no longer need to make yourself smaller so the story can stay comfortable. And here is the part most people do not want to hear. Sometimes the image you are protecting is not his. It is yours. The image of being the woman who could understand him when no one else could. The woman who could love him through his confusion. The woman whose patience would unlock his heart. The woman who would be rewarded for seeing something beautiful in him before he could see it in himself. That image can be seductive. It gives the pain a purpose. It makes suffering feel meaningful. It lets you believe your endurance is proof of depth. But depth without truth becomes a sinkhole. And the psyche eventually asks for a different kind of depth. Not the depth of waiting longer, but the depth of seeing clearly. There is a moment in that seeing when you may feel embarrassed. You may think, "How did I not see this sooner? Why did I keep explaining this away? Why did I keep giving the benefit of the doubt when my body was already saying no?" Be gentle with yourself there. Because the psyche does not reveal everything at once. It reveals what you can survive. And often, you needed the fantasy until you were ready to outgrow it. Often, the image was a bridge. The problem was not that you once believed. The problem was refusing to cross into reality after the bridge had served its purpose. That is why truth can feel like grief and relief at the same time. Grief for what you hoped. Relief for what you no longer have to carry. And relief matters. Relief is the beginning of nervous system repair. Relief is what happens when the body finally stops bracing for a message that was never coming in the form you wanted. Relief is what happens when your mind stops defending a person who is not defending your heart. The next question is not, "How do I make him see my worth?" The next question is, "Why did I need to hide my own truth in order to keep feeling worthy?" That question opens the real work. Because if your self-worth depends on protecting someone else's image, then your worth is still being negotiated externally. If your peace depends on pretending not to know what you know, then your peace is built on a fragile surface. If your love requires self-editing, then love has become a place where you disappear. And that is exactly what individuation begins to correct. Individuation is the long process of becoming who you are, not who keeps the peace, not who preserves the fantasy, not who performs the role, not who survives by adaptation alone. It is the movement toward wholeness, and wholeness often starts with a refusal to lie to yourself one more time. Not dramatically, not with a speech, sometimes just quietly. No, I will not keep saying he is better than his behavior. No, I will not keep making excuses for what hurts me. No, I will not keep protecting an image that requires me to betray my own perception. That is a turning point, and once it happens, you may notice that the emotional grip begins to loosen. Not instantly, not magically, but enough to breathe differently, enough to look at the situation without immediately collapsing into hope or shame, enough to see that your heart does not need to be confused in order to be loyal. Loyalty to truth is deeper than loyalty to a fantasy. The old version of you may have believed that being loving meant defending him from your own clarity. The wiser version knows that love without truth becomes a performance, and performance is exhausting. You do not need to be cruel to stop performing. You only need to be honest. Honesty may sound simple, but in a psyche that has been trained to protect, it is revolutionary. It says, "I can tolerate reality." It says, "I do not need to decorate the wound." It says, "I can let the image fall without falling apart with it." And when the image falls, what remains is often quieter than you expected. A room, a phone, a night window, your own breathing. No dramatic thunder, no cinematic collapse, just the honest shape of what is there. That honesty is a doorway. On the other side is not bitterness. On the other side is not revenge. On the other side is not the fantasy of making him regret what he did. On the other side is a woman who no longer needs to betray herself to keep someone else innocent in her mind. She can still care. She can still remember. She can still feel the ache. But she no longer confuses ache with instruction. She no longer lets longing outrank reality. She no longer asks her own heart to keep lying for the sake of a story that has already ended in all the ways that matter. And if he comes back into the frame one day, he will not be meeting the same woman who kept protecting his image. He will meet a woman who has learned to tell the difference between tenderness and self-abandonment. A woman who can see clearly and still remain open. A woman who does not require fantasy to feel worthy of love. That is not punishment. That is growth. And if he does not come back, the truth remains just as important. You will still have returned to yourself. You will still have stopped giving your life force to an image. You will still have reclaimed the part of you that knew, all along, that clarity is not cold. Clarity is mercy. It saves you from turning a human being into a shrine and your own needs into an inconvenience. It saves you from confusing your capacity to understand with your obligation to endure. It saves you from making his confusion more important than your peace. The phone can stay face down now, not because you have become numb, because you have become honest. And honesty has a way of making the room feel larger. The air comes back, the shoulders soften. The body no longer has to keep one eye on the screen and the other on the story it has been using to survive. There is a quiet dignity in that moment. A woman standing in her own room, no longer rehearsing excuses for what she knows. No longer polishing his image at the expense of her own reality. No longer asking silence to mean something it does not. No longer calling pain by prettier names. Just truth. Just breath. Just the beginning of peace that does not depend on being chosen by someone who could not meet her clearly. My silence is not a game. It is my return to myself. And that return does not need permission.